Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the next in our policing research seminars. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here this afternoon. The Police Research Seminar Series is something that we put on at PIER. My name's Sam Lundrigan. For those that don't know me, I'm the director of PIER, the Policing Institute for the Eastern Region. And we've been putting on these this seminar series for a number of years with the intent to bring together our policing colleagues, hopefully across the region, together with academics at Anglia Ruskin who are researching in key areas of relevance to crime, criminal justice system and policing. Today I am absolutely delighted to be able to introduce one of our very own PhD students, Joanne Traynor, who has been with us since 2017. Jo has many years experience. You might hate me for saying this, but I think over 20 years experience of working as a control room supervisor. And she's brought that experience and that expertise to her PhD and her passion for the subject to her PhD topic, which from my perspective, and I am a bit biased as a supervisor, but I think is really important research, which I think has been recognised by the fact that she has a College of Policing bursary to conduct this research. And she's really bringing a light, shining a light on the voices of communications officers, such a vital role that they play in the access to the police. So this is her first, I think, presentation of her of sort of preliminary results. So I'm really thrilled that she's here today, and I've no doubt that her work is going to be really important, both in terms of the contribution to knowledge that it will bring, but also the implications for policy and practice within the control room environment. So we have question field open at the side of your screen, so please, if you have any questions for Jo, please do pop them in there. We'll try and get through as many of those as we can at the end of her presentation, but it leaves me nothing else to do other than say welcome, Jo, and thank you.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Joanne Traynor. I work as a control room supervisor for a police force, and I've been lucky enough to be granted a bursary funding to complete my PhD with Anglia Ruskin University. First of all, I'd like to say a big thank you to Sam for the very kind introduction, and I'd like to thank you all for attending. To PIER and Anglia Ruskin for inviting me to present the indicative findings of my research, Voices of Communication Officers, an exploration of factors which influence the coding and interpretation of police incident logs. I'd also very quickly like to thank the host police service for allowing me such unfettered access to their control room. As Sam said, the funding has come from the College of Policing through their bursary scheme, so thank you to them. And of course, all the wonderful communication officers, which I spent a great deal of time with, and without which the research couldn't have taken place. Slide 2, please, Winnie, thank you. So to begin with, I'd like to show you an image of a typical police control room. Now, this isn't the host organisation, but for those who've never seen a control room, this is a typical setup. And if you were to visit a police control room, what you see are lots of very busy people, but what you won't really get a feel for is what's going on in the room, as the communication process that occurs here is not transparent, because everybody's attached to headphones. Call handlers, they're talking to members of the public, the radio dispatch operators, well, they're talking to police officers via the radio system. So the role of communication officers, they either perform call handling or radio dispatch. Call handlers answer emergency and non-emergency calls from the public. They draw out salient facts and establish threat, harm and risk. And this information is then used to create an incident log, which includes a summary of the matter reported and is coded by category and grade. The category chosen by the call handler reflects a general description of the matter reported. So, for example, a domestic, a disturbance or a robbery. The grading chosen by the call handler reflects their risk assessment of how swiftly police should attend. So that will either be an emergency with blue lights, a priority, a scheduled or an appointment response. The incident is then passed via the command and control system to radio dispatch operators. Now, they haven't participated in the discourse event, so dispatch haven't spoken to the caller and are unable to listen to the original call. On receipt of an incident, dispatch mobilise a police response based upon the call handler's coding. And in this way, communication officers are the authors and interpreters of powerful and significant texts, which I thought was really rather odd that such little attention has been paid to the role of communication officer by either policing or academics. Policing has generally conceptualised this role as a civilian one. Although police officers can perform the role, it's generally considered an entry-level role. It's reasonably low paid, and unlike police officers, there are very few opportunities of lateral movement or progression within the control room for staff. Policing has measured performance outcomes. The number of calls answered, incidents allocated, and academics have paid attention to emergency call handling. This research has largely been conducted by linguists interested in developing and extending theories of conversation analysis. Yet the voices of communication officers, the people who are performing this really critical role, have largely remained unheard. And it's critical for a number of reasons. Firstly, communication officers are the first point of public contact and represent the interface between the institution and the public. But also in their coding and interpreting of incident logs, communication officers also influence policy, as the analysis of incident log coding informs policing policy and future policing strategies. So it was really odd to me that there was such a dearth of research in this area. If I could have the next slide, please. Therefore, my research aims to explore factors which influence the coding and interpretation of police incident logs by communication officers, and in doing so will bring the voices of communication officers to both policy makers and academics. There were a number of research questions, as you can imagine, so I settled on two. What factors influence the categorisation and coding of incident logs created by police call handlers, and what factors influence the interpretation of incident logs by dispatch operators? So these questions investigate the relationship between call handling and radio dispatch for the very first time. And I hope that by listening and reflecting on the views and opinions of communication officers and providing an answer to these questions, policing will be able to critically reflect on the coding and interpretation of police incident logs to inform practice and improve both performance and service. Can I have the next slide, please? So a little word about methodology. How did I choose to go about this research process? Well, I chose a mixed methods ethnography, and that's quite a mouthful for anybody. But ethnography is basically a research process of learning about people's experiences from them. I wanted to explore coding and interpretive decision making across a year, which I analysed using descriptive statistics in order to identify trends and patterns. Then I wanted to talk to communication officers after they made a coding or an interpretive decision to understand why these patterns emerged. To do this, I conducted around 48 hours of interviews with communication officers after they either coded or interpreted an incident log. I did this because I wanted to gather situated reflections there and then. I didn't want to go back to last night's duty or what happened last week. I wanted situated reflections. So I divided observations into 2-hour slots and conducted interviews over 2 24-hour periods. So while I was there at 6 in the morning for the early shift, I sat with communication officers as they battled the very busy late turns, and I did my best to stay awake at 3 in the morning during the night shifts. And in this small way, I shared their reality, and I could observe a range of incidents, which those in policing will know alter due to the time of day. So there are lots of road traffic collisions on earlies, domestic incidents periodic during late turn, suspects making off over the night shift, and all the fun of the fair that the nighttime economy brings. These interviews were fed into a thematic analysis software system called In Vivo, where I could collate themes from the interviews. So let's see what I found. Next slide, please. Thank you. Across the year, there were 316,212 original incidents created by call handlers. I say original incidents as police control rooms manage an awful lot of duplicate reporting. We're all good citizens, and if we see something dodgy going on, we'll ring 999, we'll call from our mobile phones when we feel the police should attend. So there's lots and lots of duplicate reporting, and these were removed from the data set. What I found was over the year, the majority of call handlers' incident codings remained stable and were acted upon by dispatch with no alteration or reinterpretation. However, the data also revealed that dispatch applied grading and category changes to call handlers' initial coding. Grading changes were applied to 20.11% of incidents and category changes to 7.36%, and changes to both category and grading 0.57%. Now, those of you who work in control rooms will be aware that risk does alter over time, and that new information received often alters risk very swiftly. And it would make absolute sense for changes to be applied to incidents to reflect the change in risk. So these were removed from the data set to investigate incident reinterpretations by dispatch more closely. If I could have the next slide, please, Winnie, thank you. What was left with 30,613 incidents, so roughly 10% that had been reinterpreted by dispatch. And of these incidents, I found that overwhelmingly dispatch were applying a less urgent grade than the one assigned by the court. And this really interested me, so I decided to dig deeper. If I could have the next slide, please, Winnie. Thank you. When I talked to communication officers as they made situated risk assessments and interpretive decisions, 3 very significant themes emerged. Now, there were other themes than these, and they'll be in the PhD, but I'm still in the process of analysing my data and still in the process of getting to grips with the themes. But I'd like to share these 3 with you today in the time that we have. And the themes were policy, rhetoric and risk. So I could have the next slide, please. The first theme I'd like to present is policy. Policy can be considered a set of institutional guidelines which constrain some actions whilst enabling others. Communication officers have no rank and no specific policing powers. However, they are required to make decisions and enforce a range of policies. For example, when to record an incident, the category and grading for the incident, and whether to allocate a police response, and how swiftly police should respond. Communication officers argued that where an incident category had a defined policy which dictated both the coding of the matter and the allocation of the response, that discretion was constrained and need not be applied. This enabled a swift coding with no interpretation. In the first example, the call handler reveals that the policy surrounding an aircraft in distress constrained their response. And she says, There is a procedure that will be followed, a standing set of actions. There is no way anyone, dispatch will say, you know what, they never crash, let's downgrade it and we're not going. That will never happen to that job because the job has a response that's nothing to do with me. In this example, a definitive coding strategy was used. The call handler was aware that policy will also constrain dispatch's response, suggesting that grading changes would never be applied to this category. Dispatch also felt constrained by policy, which precluded the need to interpret incidents. In the second example, the dispatcher reveals that they are further enabled by policy, as the requirement for police to attend is absolute, that there will be little pushback or resistance from officers and virtual audiences such as sergeants and inspectors. The dispatcher says in the second example, pub fights or something with weapons, that's always an emergency all day long. It's policy, threat to life. They're easy to allocate to police officers. Anything else is like asking them to sacrifice their most treasured possession to their worst enemy. So some really profound thoughts. So for this dispatcher and call handler, policy was assisting them, making their life simpler because there was no interpretation or discretion required, just following the policy. However, some policies absolutely invited discretion. If I could have the next slide, please. The most commonly discussed policy was the concern for welfare or concern for safety policy, which requires communication officers to identify an immediate threat of harm to life or property, where the police are the most appropriate agency to respond. In this example, the call handler discusses her concerns for an elderly lady, that whilst ambulance may be the most appropriate agency to deal, the ambulances have reported a delay which has increased the risk. The call handler argued that the presence of policy invited coding discretion and the application of their own interpretation of what constitutes an immediate threat to life, as this wasn't clearly defined and for them felt fuzzy. Call handlers also understood that their definition of risk may not be shared with dispatch, and therefore the policy enables dispatch to apply their own interpretation of the reported matter and apply their own discretion and ideological position, which may alter the incident coding. The call handler here says, if you want someone to go to a concern call, you write War and Peace on that job. We're going to this lady. She's 90 years old. She's fallen over. An ambulance have 6-hour delays. The more you feel the need to express your justification for something, the more you write. So in this example, to ensure dispatch upheld their coding, the call handler, in their words, felt they needed to write War and Peace on the incident to persuade and justify their coding rationale and risk assessment. The themes of rhetoric and persuasion as an influencing factor to the coding and interpretation of incidents recurred often during the interviews. If I could have the next slide, please, Winnie. So this became my next theme, the theme of rhetoric and persuasion across the FCR. Call handlers felt a need to persuade dispatch to follow their risk assessment. They feared dispatch altering their incident coding, as they felt this was an indication that they lacked experience or expertise. In the first example, the call handler says, in my experience, you have to justify your job. You need to expand your story for the story to be convincing enough for them, that's dispatch, to take action. It's irritating sometimes. The second example reveals that dispatch often assumed that call handlers made errors of judgment. New call handlers incidents were easily recognisable to them as their police issued collar number, which appears alongside the incident log, reveals their length of service and therefore, according to many dispatchers, their level of expertise. The second quote says, If the collar is someone that's been here a long time or someone I know, then I'll check the text. But if it's a new call handler or one I don't know, I'd be changing the grading and assume they got it wrong. So there's a suggestion here that dispatchers may be altering the grading of incidents because they doubt the call handler's expertise. Culturally, dispatch was considered a more expert role than call handling within the control room, and the movement from the call handling role to the dispatch role was generally the only promotion available to call handlers. Call handlers valued the opinions of dispatch operators and felt it was important that dispatch considered them to be competent. Therefore, call handlers were fearful of dispatch, applying coding changes as they felt this was an indication that they were a bad call handler. Interestingly, the final quotation reveals traces of this workplace socialisation, or, learning on the job, where call handlers were being taught tacitly by dispatch to code and categorise incident logs by altering call handlers' coding. That this alteration felt for call handlers that they had made an error and they'd got something wrong, that less coding changes applied to their risk assessments, the better they were at their role. The final quote on the slide says, "You worry about gradings when dispatch writes stuff on your job and change it, but I've learned how to get it right now." For me, this also revealed the real importance of a mixed method study. So whilst the incident coding trend data revealed that the vast majority of incident log coding was stable and overwhelmingly not altered by dispatch, this may be influenced by social and cultural factors, where call handlers seek to appear expert to dispatchers, who, after all, are considered to be more experienced. And the dispatchers exert influence over call handlers' coding by training them through the coding alterations they make. But do remember, ultimately, the call handler is the only person who engages with the caller, and the call handler is the only person who really knows the threat, harm and risk. And dispatch make alterations and interpretations based on the text provided by the call handler. So alterations may have more to do with the call handler's ability to use language to persuade dispatch than the threat, harm and risk present. If I could have the next slide, please. The influence of rhetoric and persuasion was also a common theme for dispatch. Dispatch argued that allocating emergency matters where threat to life was clear and apparent was relatively simple. Yet allocating police officers to more mundane matters was more problematic. They reported being continually challenged by police officers of rank and often subjected to verbal attacks, where dispatchers felt they were unable to retort. And this is because the radio discussions between dispatch and officers can be heard by everyone listening to a particular radio channel, and it's considered very bad form for a dispatcher, an unranked civilian member of staff, to redress an officer over the radio. The knowable reality felt by dispatch that they may be attacked, and attempts to allocate incidents may be met with pushback and perceived abuse, was an influencing factor for dispatchers' decisions to alter incident coding. In the first example here, dispatch say, "You have the officers and sergeants arguing with you. When you're supervising, the divisional commander argues with you about where the controller," that's the dispatcher, "is deploying resources. I'm not a police officer, I have no rank. If I can't sell the job to them, they won't go, simple as." So there is this merging theme of rhetoric and persuasion across the control room. the call handler needing and wanting to persuade dispatch to follow their instruction, their grading and categorisation, and dispatch knowing that in a time of very, very limited police resources, that actually their instruction to a police officer to attend an incident may have more to do with their own ability to persuade police officers to go than any other factor. In the second example, the dispatcher says, I try and allocate, and I think please just go. Please don't treat me like I'm dog dirt for asking you to do your job. It's sometimes easier to change the grade than put yourself through that all day, every day. If I could have the next slide, please, Winnie. A further theme that emerged was one of risk. Call handlers and dispatch operators, well, they manage risk all day, every day. And it's a very tough thing to do at the end of a telephone or at the end of a radio system. Call handlers felt that policies which encouraged them to apply discretion left them in fear of making incorrect decisions. And if we recall the concern policy, where they were required to establish immediate threat to life or property, actually making those decisions over the phone, well, you know, that's a tough thing to do sometimes. And it led call handlers to be very, very fearful. And this is what one of the call handlers had to say. I've told the management I sit in fear of losing my job every single day. This feeling of fear was often mitigated by call handlers by coding incidents to reflect a more urgent grade. These incidents upon arrival at dispatch may have influenced dispatchers' conceptualisation that call handlers lacked expertise and knowledge. The perceived frequency of grading changes and the expert knowledge of dispatch also appeared to encourage call handlers to pass risk onto dispatch, letting them decide if the coding should remain or be altered. In this example, the call handler says, I hate the attitude I will put our job on just to be safe. We have people here that will say, put the job on an immediate. They, meaning dispatch, can downgrade if it's wrong. So call handlers often felt the assessment of risk, the application of discretion, put their jobs and livelihoods in jeopardy, particularly where policies required them to apply discretion. To mitigate this risk, call handlers frequently overgraded incidents and felt that dispatch could downgrade if dispatch felt confident in shouldering that burden of risk. If I could have the next slide, please. Dispatch, however, framed risk against demand. Now, radio dispatch is a very, very difficult and demanding role. Not only do dispatchers have to manage the incidents that come to them from call handlers, they have to manage the requests of police officers at the scene of incidents. And they have to ensure the safety of those police officers. If those police officers get into trouble, the radio dispatcher is the person that responds to their whispered requests and shouts and screams. The person who mobilises help and ensures their safety. So it's absolutely no mean feat to be a radio dispatcher. So they're required to respond to requests of multiple police officers deployed to simultaneous live incidents. And remember, emergencies, they don't come along one after the other like buses. They come all at once to a dispatcher who may be managing 3 or 4 emergency incidents all at once. And this dispatcher says, there are 70 jobs on my list. It will take 10 interrupted minutes to read each one. Then jobs coming in, then call handlers sending jobs for me to triage because they are unsure. Every time I pick up a job, I am at risk. Every job I don't read because it's too busy puts me at risk. I feel physically sick every day. The list the dispatcher is referring to here are outstanding unallocated incidents which police officers have not been deployed to, as other more urgent incidents have taken priority. Now, if a dispatcher has 70 outstanding incidents on their list and it takes 10 uninterrupted minutes to read each one, if you do the maths in your head, that works out at 11.6 hours. And their entire duty is 9.5 hours, so it's impossible for them sometimes to manage risk faced with the kinds of demands put upon them and also the police service in general. And the second quote says, if you haven't got a backup, you look down the list and only pick up emergencies, but that's a risk because call handlers are so bad. Dispatchers for the host force were often supported by backup or support operators. However, staffing levels applied meant that the backup or support operator was not resourced all of the time. And in these instances, dispatch often felt they could only read and respond to emergency incidents, and they didn't trust call handlers' incident coding, preferring to alter the coding and citing call handlers' lack of expertise. Dispatch often felt that call handlers sent them incidents to triage that shouldn't come to them. They felt that call handlers lacked expertise and knowledge, and because of this, they felt at risk. If I could have the next slide, please, Winnie. So in summary, overwhelmingly, most incident grades and categories remained unchanged across the year. Policy, rhetoric and risk emerged as important influencing factors to both the coding and interpretation of police incident logs, and most interpretive activity was applied to incidents where policy is ambiguous and there was little institutional oversight. Call handlers revealed that they moderate gradings to appease dispatch, and dispatch revealed that they struggle to allocate mundane matters to police officers and felt pressure to alter incident gradings. So if I could take the next slide, please. So having said all of that, what are the indicative implications for policing? Well, at the moment, police services apply their own frameworks to incident log quality. However, I believe there should be a nationally shared quality framework so that performance across forces can be measured to enable evidence-based critical reflection and draw out best practice which can be shared and used to develop support and teaching packages for communication officers. I believe that the profile of communication officers within policing should be raised. This is an incredibly difficult job to do, communicating with people in extreme circumstances alongside supporting and ensuring the welfare of deployed officers. So rather than being conceptualised as entry-level employees, the role of the communications officer needs to be acknowledged and their profile within policing raised. There is a need to develop concise policies which support communication officers as they perform this incredibly demanding role. More concise policies will remove the need to continually apply discretion, which in reality is asking communication officers to dig deep into their own ideological bag of ideas about what is and is not an emergency, what is a threat to life and what is not, all at the end of a telephone. Finally, that unless threat, harm and risk has altered over time, that call handlers' risk assessments and expertise are considered a tactical instruction to dispatch and virtual audiences. If I could take the next slide, please, Winnie. I'd like to leave you not with my thoughts, but with the voices of communication officers. If you don't put the right stuff on a job, the grading changes. You have to find a way to show them, that's dispatch, the risk. At the end of the day, you're dealing with people's lives. You're dealing with people on the worst day of their lives. And from dispatch, you just spend every day hoping you have done the right thing, and that when you go home, everyone is still breathing. If I can take the next slide, please, Winnie, thank you. Thank you. I feel like I've rushed through my presentation because it's the first time doing it live and online for me. But thank you so much for coming today and listening to the indicative findings of my research. There should be time for some questions at the end. However, should you wish to contact me independently of this event, here is my email address, and I'd be happy to enter into a debate or answer any questions that you might have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jo. Can you hear me?